The first thing a man must do in this situation is recognize what is actually happening beneath the surface. When a child suddenly becomes distant, cold, or even hostile toward a father, the immediate reaction is often confusion or emotional pain. Many fathers begin asking themselves painful questions. Asterisk, what did I do wrong? Why does my child suddenly treat me like an enemy? Asterisk, but in many cases, the answer is not found in the child's independent judgment. It is found in a subtle and often deliberate form of psychological manipulation. A narcissistic personality does not simply seek control over a partner. It seeks control over the narrative of reality itself. And when a child becomes part of that dynamic, the child can unknowingly become a psychological instrument in a deeper conflict. The narcissistic parent may present themselves as the victim, distort past events, or plant small seeds of doubt in the child's mind. These seeds rarely appear as open attacks. Instead, they are disguised as concern, disappointment, or even false sympathy. What makes this particularly powerful is that children naturally trust the parent who speaks with emotional certainty. They absorb interpretations of reality long before they develop the ability to question them. Over time, the child may begin to repeat phrases, attitudes, and judgments that clearly did not originate from their own experience. In this moment, the father must understand something extremely important. Reacting with anger will only confirm the narrative that has already been planted. Recognition, therefore, becomes the first act of psychological strength. When you understand that you are dealing with manipulation rather than simple misunderstanding, you stop fighting the wrong battle. Instead of reacting impulsively, you begin observing carefully. You see the pattern, you see the strategy, and this awareness changes everything. Because the moment you recognize the game being played, you are no longer merely a wounded participant in it. You become someone capable of responding with clarity, patience, and intention. And that realization marks the beginning of reclaiming not only your relationship with your child, but your psychological authority as a father. Once a father begins to recognize the psychological dynamics at play, the next challenge is far more difficult than it first appears. It requires discipline over one's own emotional impulses. When a child begins repeating accusations, showing hostility, or treating a father with suspicion, the instinctive reaction is to defend oneself immediately. Many men feel the urge to expose the manipulation and tell the child the truth about the mother. Yet this is precisely where many fathers unknowingly fall into the trap that has been prepared for them. A narcissistic personality often anticipates this reaction. In fact, the manipulation frequently relies on it. The child may already have been told subtle stories that portray the father as angry, unstable, selfish, or emotionally dangerous. These narratives are planted quietly, sometimes over months or years. And when the father finally explodes in frustration and begins attacking the mother in front of the child experiences something that appears to confirm everything they were told. From the child's perspective, the situation becomes simple. One parent appears calm and wounded, while the other appears defensive and hostile. The deeper context disappears. What remains is the emotional impression, and children, especially when they are young, rely heavily on emotional impressions to determine who is safe and who is not. This is why restraint becomes an act of profound strength. It does not mean silence in the face of injustice, nor does it mean denying the reality of manipulation. It means recognizing that the child is not the battlefield. The child is the one being psychologically pulled between two forces they cannot yet fully understand. Instead of attacking the other parent, the wiser path is to remain composed, measured, and emotionally steady. Speak with clarity when necessary, but refuse to turn the child into a judge of adult conflict. Over time, emotional consistency creates a form of truth that words alone cannot produce. Children eventually notice patterns. They observe who reacts with bitterness and who responds with quiet strength, and those observations slowly shape their understanding of reality. Because, in the long run, the parent who maintains dignity in the face of distortion becomes the one whose character cannot be easily rewritten. Once a father learns to resist the impulse to fight the battle through anger or accusation, a more important task begins to emerge. The true work lies in strengthening the emotional connection with the child. When manipulation has taken root, the natural temptation is to demand loyalty, to insist that the child see the truth, or to push them to choose a side. But emotional bonds cannot be forced through pressure. In fact, pressure often drives the child further away, especially when they are already caught within a confusing psychological narrative. A child who has been influenced against a parent is often experiencing an inner conflict they cannot easily express. On one hand, there is the natural attachment to the father, the memories, the shared moments, the sense of safety that once existed. On the other hand, there are new interpretations that have been quietly introduced into their mind. These interpretations can create doubt, suspicion, or emotional distance. The child may not even fully understand why they feel this shift. They simply sense that something has changed. This is where a father must become deeply intentional about presence. Not presence in the sense of simply being physically available, but emotional presence, listening without immediately correcting, showing patience when the child acts distant, engaging in simple moments of connection that do not revolve around conflict or explanation. When a father responds with calm attention instead of defensive arguments, he begins to rebuild something extremely powerful: psychological safety. Children are far more perceptive than we often assume. They notice consistency, they feel sincerity. When a father continues to show warmth, reliability, and genuine interest in the child's world, a quiet contrast begins to form in the child's mind. The emotional experience they have with their father slowly begins to challenge the narrative they may have been given. And this process cannot be rushed. Trust, once shaken, returns slowly. But every calm conversation, every moment of patience, every act of steady love becomes another piece of evidence stored in the child's memory. Because in the end, the strongest bond between a parent and a child is not built through arguments about truth. It is built through the undeniable experience of being consistently loved. Once a father begins to rebuild emotional presence with his child, another important realization must take shape. The truth in this situation will rarely be revealed through arguments. Many fathers believe that if they simply explain the facts clearly enough, the child will suddenly see the manipulation and understand what has been happening. But human psychology, especially the psychology of a child, does not operate primarily through logical debate. It operates through lived experience. When a narcissistic parent attempts to shape a child's perception, they often rely on carefully constructed narratives. These narratives can be persuasive because they appeal to emotion rather than reason. They may paint the father as unreliable, uncaring, or even harmful in subtle ways. The natural instinct of the father is to dismantle these claims one by one, to defend himself like a lawyer presenting evidence in a courtroom. Yet the child is not a judge evaluating arguments. The child is an observer of behavior. This is why the most powerful response is not verbal defense, but consistent demonstration. Over time, behavior reveals patterns that words cannot hide. When a father continues to act with patience, responsibility, and emotional stability, he quietly creates a contrast between what the child has been told and what the child actually experiences. That contrast becomes psychologically significant. A child might hear that their father is selfish, yet repeatedly experience generosity. They might be told that he is angry, yet encounter calmness. They might hear that he does not care, yet see consistent effort to remain present and supportive. These contradictions begin to create questions in the child's mind, and questions are far more powerful than forced conclusions. It is also important to understand that children grow. As they mature, their ability to observe and interpret behavior becomes more sophisticated. The stories they were once given may no longer fully align with the reality they have personally experienced. When that moment arrives, the father's consistent character becomes undeniable evidence. In the end, truth revealed through behavior carries a quiet authority that arguments can never achieve. Because while words can be manipulated, a pattern of integrity lived over time becomes something far more difficult to distort. At this stage, another responsibility becomes essential, and it is one that many men underestimate: the protection of their own psychological boundaries. When someone with a narcissistic personality begins manipulating a child against a father, the conflict rarely stays contained within simple disagreements. It often expands into a pattern of emotional provocation. The goal, consciously or unconsciously, is to destabilize the father, to push him into reactions that weaken his position both emotionally and psychologically. A narcissistic personality feeds on reaction. Anger, desperation, endless arguments, and attempts to defend oneself at every accusation only create more energy for the conflict. The father can quickly find himself trapped in a cycle where he is constantly responding, constantly explaining, constantly trying to repair the damage created by someone else's narrative. Over time, this drains emotional strength and clouds judgment. This is why psychological boundaries become so important. A boundary in this sense is not simply refusing to speak or withdrawing from responsibility. It is a conscious decision about where your emotional energy will be invested and where it will not. It means refusing to engage in endless confrontations that serve no constructive purpose. It means recognizing when a conversation has shifted from problem solving into manipulation. Protecting these boundaries also requires clarity of mind. Many fathers find it helpful to keep careful records of important interactions, not out of paranoia, but out of awareness. When conflict becomes distorted, memory can easily be challenged or reinterpreted. Documentation preserves reality. At the same time, maintaining personal stability through reflection, trusted friendships, or professional guidance helps prevent the psychological isolation that manipulation often creates. But perhaps the most important boundary is internal. It is the refusal to allow someone else's distorted narrative to redefine your sense of who you are as a father. When a man begins doubting his own intentions, his own character, his own role, he loses the psychological ground he stands on. And once that ground is lost, every other battle becomes harder to fight. So the task is simple in principle, though difficult in practice. Guard your mind with the same seriousness with which you guard your relationship with your child, because the man who preserves his inner clarity is the man who cannot easily be broken. The final realization a father must come to is perhaps the most difficult of all. This is not a battle that is won quickly. When a child has been influenced against a parent, the instinct is to correct the situation immediately. A father wants resolution. He wants the misunderstanding cleared, the truth acknowledged, the relationship restored to what it once was. But psychological dynamics, especially those shaped over time, rarely unravel in a single moment. In situations like this, patience becomes a form of strength that is rarely discussed. A narcissistic personality often thinks in terms of immediate victories, control in the moment, emotional reactions in the present, the satisfaction of shaping perception today. But a father must think in much longer terms. His task is not to win an argument this week or even this year. His task is to remain a stable and trustworthy presence throughout the child's development. Children grow, and as they grow, their understanding deepens. What they once accepted without question eventually becomes something they begin to examine. A teenager starts noticing inconsistencies in stories. A young adult begins reflecting on childhood memories with new awareness. Emotional experiences that once felt confusing begin to make sense through maturity and perspective. When that stage arrives, the father's past behavior becomes incredibly important. Every moment of patience, every refusal to speak with bitterness, every consistent effort to remain present quietly accumulates in the child's memory. Those moments become reference points the child will eventually revisit. They begin asking themselves simple but powerful questions. Asterisk, if my father was truly the person I was told he was, why did he behave the way he did? Why was he always steady? Why did he never try to turn me against anyone? Asterisk, these questions open the door to independent understanding. And when a child arrives at truth through their own reflection, that realization is far more powerful than anything imposed through argument. This is why a father must play what could be called the long psychological game, not with manipulation, but with integrity sustained over time. Because in the end, the greatest victory is not forcing a child to see the truth today. It is living in such a way that one day they cannot avoid seeing it.